Welcome to the Science Salon Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. As always, we appreciate your support for the podcast and for the Skeptics Society in general. You can show your support at skeptic.com/donate, or you just go on there and you'll see a donate button, which you can do through Patreon or through our own donation page, through PayPal, through checks. You can even phone the office. And all the information is right there on our homepage at skeptic.com, how to contact us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization devoted to promoting science and critical thinking, reason, logic, and so on. And we've been around for over 25 years. So most of our kind of old school patrons and supporters come in the form of checks and so forth. And, that's changing. The environment of supporting content online now is mostly done online. So I'm trying to migrate our supporters over to online support. So to the extent that you value this podcast or the work that we do at Skeptic Magazine and Junior Skeptic and eSkeptic every Wednesday. By the way, if you haven't signed up for eSkeptic, you can do so at skeptic.com. It's free. And we post a lot of free content every week. This podcast on Wednesdays, plus usually an article or review from the magazine. My guest today is Mark Moffett. Dr. Moffett is a longtime friend. I've actually known Mark since the 90s. I think we met through Frank Sulloway. And I've always known him as an ant biologist. He got his PhD at Harvard under E.O. Wilson. And as well as his photography in National Geographic. If you look up Mark Moffett and National Geographic, you'll see some of his photographs. He's an amazing photographer, and we discussed that a little bit. He talks about the photography as a tool for telling a story, which I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it's an interesting way to think about it. He's got some great stories about Ed Wilson and some other scientists he's traveled with. He's one of these people that has traveled all over the world. He spends probably more time on the road than anybody I know. So the new book, here it is. It's a beautifully produced book, How Our Societies Arise, Thrive, and Fall. The Human Swarm. The swarm indicates that we're another animal, a little bit like insects, but we're not quite like that. So we get into talking about human nature, what a society is, and why it's unrelated to the size. So we go through bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states, nations, what those words mean in terms of the structure and size of groups. But societies can be as small or large as you want. And in fact, he starts off with ants and works his way up. Chimps and bonobos and humans, of course, and elephants and other species, and all the different markers we use to distinguish one another and to find commonality amongst people, particularly strangers we don't know. How weird it is that humans can walk into a room, a Starbucks, say a cafe, and you know nobody, and yet we don't. It doesn't erupt into violence. Whereas if a chimp walked into a cafe with a bunch of chimps from another group, he'd probably be killed. So why is that? And that's true for most vertebrate species, Mark says. So we are unusual in that regard. He says it's not because of our language or our intelligence, our IQ. It's our ability to think abstractly has nothing to do with that. So you'll have to listen to find out what the explanation is. It's very interesting. I learned a lot from this. So with that, I give you Mark Moffett. I was trying to remember how long we've known each other. I think I must have met you in the late 90s, right?
You know, my wife says I should have a hospital bracelet on at all times. It says I don't know what year or month it is. I literally live in the present. So I know I've known you forever, approximately. Maybe as long as Frank Sulloway. Maybe there's some connection there, but I'm not quite sure.
I think that is where we met, through Frank in the late 90s, maybe. Well, I initially knew you through your photography. You were a National Geographic award-winning photographer. So maybe before we get into your book, I will have introduced you already, so don't worry about that. That we should talk a little bit about your background. I mean, you have a very unusual background as a scientist. You were trained at Harvard under the great E.O. Wilson. But then you wandered off into this adventurous life where you've been all over the world, and as a National Geographic photographer and a cave explorer, and I don't know what all else you do. Give us a little bit of background how you ended up on that non-traditional career path, as we might say.
Oh, well, you have your own non-traditional path. The non-traditional paths are something that is allowed in America. I know, Jack Horner and others. These people that we creep through the sides, and I wouldn't have survived the system of Japan or China where everything is so regimented. So I do think that despite the weaknesses of our educational system, there can be points of advantage. So I crept through. I'm a high school dropout who started studying with some biologists and eventually published several papers as an undergraduate. They let me into a small liberal arts college called Beloit College. And I still have no idea how I did anything. People call me an entomologist, but I've never taken a course in entomology. In fact, I've taken rather few biology courses. I hate courses, and that is one reason why I've become non-traditional since graduate school, is because I don't want to give anybody grades. I don't understand grades. I like the B students more than the A students. And so I am lucky to have gotten around that. And I also don't like meetings. So, academics, they go to meetings and they give grades. And so I've avoided that. On the other hand, this is not a consistent income stream. I have, in fact, learned how to take pictures. I did in graduate school to document my work on ants in Asia. I figured if I didn't take pictures and I came back with all these weird stories, people would think I was sitting around smoking something strange with a guru somewhere. So I had to figure out how to take pictures, which I did using a book on photographing supermodels and applying it to ants, which are all female supermodels in my view. So there you go.
That's really funny.
I just sort of randomly went there. But, basically, I believe one should invent oneself every 5 years. And I've been working on this book for 6. So obviously something's going to happen next, and I'm not quite sure what that is. So I've tried various things. Photography interests me only as a tool for telling stories. And if I don't have a story that requires photography, like the current book, I don't care about the camera. In fact, it's a very annoying thing. If you picked up an actual 35 millimeter camera, it's impossibly antiquarian now. And they're always like breaking or getting dusty or something in the field. So.
And you did that when it was film, not digital, right? When you started.
My gosh, what was I thinking even? But as a storytelling tool, it's amazing. So I had wonderful stories I told largely with National Geographic from the very start. And, now I've done something like 30 articles with them and had several hundred photographs. So I feel I have nothing to prove. Plus, I've kind of run out of my childhood story favorites. So I'm on to other things now. So you can tell me what I should be doing next term, or you can explain it to me.
It's nice to not know where you're going to be, because that kind of keeps the door open and it allows you to wander off into new projects like you did here. But first, what was it like to work with or study with Ed Wilson? I mean, he's such a legend now. But when you met him, he was just kind of a regular world-class scientist.
He was a regular legend, yes. Now, when I do see him, it's sometimes with someone like Harrison Ford or something, and I go, my goodness, I didn't even know he had the general cultural interests in such things, and yet he's got such a following, and it's amazing how his career went along. Even though he's a traditional scientist, he certainly is not traditional in the normal sense. So your book is dedicated to him and Irv DeVore too, your other mentor. Irv DeVore was kind of another mentor. I didn't see him as often as Ed, but I saw him the last few years. Irv was one of the founders of sociobiology in the field of anthropology, and got people like Bob Trivers and others started that are essential to the field now. And so he had long retired, and I showed up at his house every once in a while. And he would put me up somewhere, and he was like a grand wizard, a long white beard at this point, and he would have proclamations, and his house was full of these iconic icons, like various tribal things. And so it really was like being in the Lord of the Rings. And so he would make proclamations and I would carry on and he would say this and I would say that. And so he was a great sounding board for me for some of this book. And he died suddenly a couple months after I last saw him. And there was a big celebration of his life. That was maybe 2 years ago.
Well, Darwin published his 2 books, The Descent of Man and The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, in the 1870s. But it wasn't really until the 1970s with Ed's sociobiology book, 76, I guess, that really made it acceptable, or I guess not at the time, but now it is, to apply evolutionary theory to human society, human psychology, human cognition, and so forth. Why do you think it took so long?
Everybody has their domain of interest, and I don't believe in this whole domain of interest thing. I kind of like to free range. And so I am definitely in league with Ed Wilson in terms of the idea of consilience, bringing different subjects together. But I think there's a realization I had that the other subjects actually have a lot to contribute to biology. And my personal belief of this equality back and forth has made it really easy for me to get to know psychologists and anthropologists and talk to them without anything too adversarial going on. And it's been wonderful. So, I've given virtually the same talk to biology departments as anthropology and psychology departments, and even a sociology department or two, and everyone listens and people have cool questions afterwards.
So you're suggesting that the kind of balkanization of the academy throughout the 20th century put up barriers between scientists that couldn't communicate as clearly, and so that consilience couldn't happen.
Yeah, and I think some of that is this fear of reductionism by other disciplines, particularly by sociologists. And I made an effort in the new book to give them a nod or two whenever I could. Whether that's going to break through anything or not, I'm not sure. The issues of sociologists around societies are actually rather interesting. You would think the idea of a society wouldn't be controversial, but some sociologists think of societies as an invention of modern times, that nations in particular are imagined communities brought together by the mass media. And I attempt to show through the book that, in fact, societies are at the core of our humanity throughout history and prehistory. We've never not lived in societies. And when you realize that, you can start addressing questions about where human attributes came from that have to do with being in these bounded groups, and in a really interesting way, and that I think can be of use across the disciplines as well.
So your book is titled The Human Swarm. The subtitle really tells us what the book is about, how our societies arise, thrive, and fall. By the way, it's a beautiful cover, and the production of the book, the production qualities is really high. I always appreciate that. I'm an old school guy that likes to read physical books. But tell us what you mean by the human swarm. What are you trying to capture there?
Well, it's almost a bit too insectoid, but in fact, one of the key stories I tell in the book that I think is essential to understanding humanity is the most amazing thing we do. And that is we can walk into a coffee shop and people don't want to instantly kill us or all run up and try to figure out who we are, or we don't want to run away. This would be impossible for a chimpanzee or most other vertebrates. You see, those species have no strangers in their societies, and it's a overlooked fact that humans allow for strangers, and therefore we can have this swarming that we see in places like New York. You can have societies of basically infinite size as long as there's resources for the people. Societies can continue to grow. So why is that? When did that capacity come about? And what does it tell us about people generally is the subject of the book. And when you look at those issues, you can start to address broader questions of the reproduction of societies, where societies come from and where they go. And E.O. Wilson, Ed Wilson, my mentor, did a book called Sociobiology, and it was curious that he didn't even address this question anywhere in the book, and virtually no one has since. It seems to be a really essential question when we face our own society and its apparent stability. Is there a cycle to societies? What are the signs that a society is beginning to break down? What happens when a new society builds up?
So let's define our terms carefully here. So you're using the word society in many different contexts. You also talk about bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, and nations, but there can be societies at any of those levels. So kind of walk us through what all those different words mean in the context of thinking about how our civilization arose.
Well, a society is a group of closed to outsiders that we most have passion for, want to fight for, and sometimes even die for. Societies last through the generations, and we expect membership in societies to be involuntary. So when you look at societies that way, you see a variety of animals have societies too. Now, modern humans have, over the last many hundreds of years, evolved created all kinds of other kinds of groupings within societies, and those are the main emphasis of a lot of psychology. But hunter-gatherers were basically focused, and we evolved to basically focus on our societies, our families, and little else. It's a really interesting fact that there were no book clubs at hunter-gatherer societies. Well, no books, but no clubs of any kind. There were a few in societies that became a little more complex, but our fundamental unit of identity seems to be around societies, and all humans have had societies, and they've had various stages of organization that we give the different names you've just mentioned.
Those are largely divided by size, I suppose, but also complexity. Like bands and tribes are pretty small, maybe Dunbar number 150 or so, and then chiefdoms.
Dunbar's number is something I address in the book, and it has nothing to do with societies. And in fact, this was a big issue for Robert Dunbar, who came up with the idea that we can have about 150 friends based on our brain size and so forth. And he made a statement when he first came up with this idea, which has become popularized. He made a statement saying, well, then how is it possible to have nation states? And he really kind of couldn't figure this out. He came up with a couple of notions that don't really work. And, when you look across species, these networks of friends that individuals have are never the entire society. Societies are not bands of brothers in humans. They're not bands of brothers in chimpanzees or elephants or what have you. Societies are memberships in which these networks occur. And because you have memberships, it's, I think, easier to form these kind of networks of relationships. This is one reason to have societies, is to have some bounds on who you have to deal with, whether they're friends or enemies.
Right. You talk about in ants that scent, sort of a molecular sign. In humans, you have the clothing you wear or the nonverbal communication signals, or how you use your hands or whatever as a signal for whether you're a fellow in-group member or out-group member.
Right. And people have been averse to comparisons of ants and humans. But, the fact is, comparing two things that are identical is really boring. It makes no sense at all. Comparisons are interesting. Similarities are interesting in things that we don't normally think of as alike. And when you find those kind of comparisons, it's often a leap in science. And the fact is that ants have a lot of similarities to humans that chimpanzees don't have. And those similarities include the way we form our societies. Most species of vertebrates they have to have individual knowledge of each other. That's the problem of the chimpanzee in the coffee shop. The chimpanzee has to know every single other chimpanzee in its community to feel comfortable in the coffee shop. If there's a foreigner there, it's in attack mode because doesn't belong. Humans can be comfortable with individuals they don't know because they use these kinds of cues. And we're using them all the time. We don't recognize it. They're often cues that we don't even know that we know. It's just that our brain processes each other. When we pass through a coffee shop, believe it or not, we're taking each other in, and faster than the blink of an eye, coming up with conclusions about them if asked, various people in the coffee shop, that is. So that those kinds of that ability to transcend our personal knowledge of each other was one of the big steps, and has led to a lot of what we worry about in modern psychology, including groups within societies and relationships between societies.
What are some of those signs that we're subconsciously picking up?
Yeah, well, most people are focused on the obvious things like language, and even those don't work because societies don't need to have their own language. Some of them share a language, like the British and the Americans. Of course, we have different accents, but there are hunter-gatherers that lost their own language and have taken on a different language from a completely outside group and so forth, or have multiple languages. So languages are really useful, but truly those interesting signs are the subtle ones, because they've turned us into what I call walking billboards for our identity. We don't even know how much information we're putting forward. And they include, there's a researcher, Abigail Marsh, in Georgetown, a psychologist, who studied a couple of things that are really fun. For example, from quite a distance, Americans usually can figure out and guess who's an American and who's not by their walk, just by how they walk or wave their hand. And they won't be able to tell you how they did it, but there's definitely a different gait for Americans. And another one of her. I
wonder what that is. Is that like that Texas swagger that George W. Bush used to show off?
Well, I think most likely it is something like that. Americans tend to be very assertive about themselves, and she was comparing us with Australians in particular, and that. Could be it. Working that out is another question. But another favorite of her studies is one in which you show someone a picture of a Japanese ancestor person, and they won't be able to tell anything about them unless they're smiling. But if they're smiling, you can usually guess whether they're American or not. Now, Darwin showed that we all smile everywhere in the world, but the truth is we're probably using our facial muscles a bit differently from place to place. And so those kind of cues, which we build up our behaviors as infants, and we respond to each other and recognize each other at a very young age, are literally everywhere. And the most obvious one that's been right in front of us the whole time, and maybe more in front of me than you, not to say anything, but is hair.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Yeah.
I wish I had your hair, man. So you should live in Southern California with that blonde surfer hair.
Oh, baby. But, people have talked a lot about the loss of our hair in the bodies, but to me, the most interesting thing is our heads of hair. Primates all groom each other, but they don't have to manage their hair. Humans have to manage their hair. All cultures manage their hair, and they do it in culturally distinct ways, particularly in the back, where you can't even see. And for most tribal groups and hunter-gatherers, those would be specific. You might have some individual twist you have on it, but they would suggest what group you belong to, very particularly. And, what I briefly tell the story in the book of bringing along a volume of pictures of tribal groups when I was in West Africa, and showing it to people. And the first thing that those people pointed to, these tribal people, was, look how weird these people's hairs are. What is they doing with their hair? So, these are signals that we're telling each other all the time, and they go from head to toe, and you don't have to say a word to be identified. In fact, if you do say a word, you're usually identified before you utter the first syllable.
Wow. Just by how you're moving your mouth and lips and
how the word comes out.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
it's one of the things I liked about the book is all your stories that you begin each chapter with, and you were in this cafe in the middle of nowhere, whatever it was. You've really traveled a lot, which I think brings some perspective in addition to all the science, that you've actually experienced some of these differences in cultures.
Yeah, well, yes, and I have, and it's a weird question of how I've come about this perspective. I don't think any of this is complicated, but somehow it takes people a while to figure out what I'm talking about sometimes. So I figure I must be askew in some sense, and that I came upon this point of view. Most people are focused on the idea of cooperation in societies and in the sciences. And in fact, we don't cooperate in societies with everybody. We have our worst enemies in our society. So that view didn't make sense to me. And, I think, one of the early moments I remember was traveling around. I was 16 years old, undergraduate. I had become an assistant to a coleopterist, a beetle expert. And I spent 6 months traveling around in very remote parts of Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. I visited 49 of the 50 largest cities in Peru, and we weren't trying to go to cities. And I remember going into these remote valleys, which were sometimes higher than any mountaintop in the 48 states, and you'd see some mossy clump, and when you get closer and you realize it's a village covered with moss, and you'd get upon it and there would be like these people with a certain dress, a certain hat, and just facial cues all over the place, their actual physical features, and you'd drive through and you'd get to the next village over the next, in the next valley, and there'd be a different hat, a different, all these things were different. And, around the world in places like New Guinea, you see groups from place to place, and these sharp identity boundaries and how they consider you and I coming in looking like, frankly, a space alien. I feel like I look like a space alien normally, so I can say that. This has become part of my daily experience. I have spent years of my life looking like I belong in outer space.
Well, let's back up for just a second. When I was in college, I took a course in ethology, as it was called at the time, animal behavior, and we used Eibelsfeldt's book on animal behavior, and it had those great photographs of him taking movie pictures and stills of people where the camera's facing this way, but it's the fake camera. The real camera's facing that way, and he's filming people giving their facial expressions. And really, since the 70s and into the 90s, when Donald Hoffman, was it? The guy that put together the list of universals.
I forget his name. I have the book. But
yeah. So
500 or something.
Yeah, and for a long time, that was like, wow, there are universals for human behavior. Well, you seem to be saying that's the boring part. Of course, there's universals. The interesting part is how the universal characteristics vary ever so slightly. And this is what creates these kind of characteristic differences between societies.
Yeah, well, that's kind of ironically somewhere in between, because what we do is our brains are programmed to, are built to ignore the universals, not treat them seriously, because to us, the differences come to the fore, and sometimes they're totally trivial, and yet they matter so much. Something that Freud looked at, how we manage that, and in fact, can overlook the fact that we have a common humanity is a really interesting problem. A basic thing that many people, David Livingston Smith has a book on it and so forth, have studied in psychology, is that even an infant a month old knows the ethnicity and race of its parents and responds more positively to other people of that ethnicity and race. That's before they know language. They do not have to be trained in this. Little kids are prejudice machines virtually. So by 3 months, kids see other ethnicities, races, and nationalities as if they were different species, as if they had essences. That is, as an elephant has a trunk and ears and tusks, people have this dress and so forth and so on, and you cannot change a duck into a goose. A person belongs to that group, and even that small child expects that their grandchildren is going to belong to that group. So we have our brains divide up people into different species, as if they were different species. Our brains do that. They treat others as if they're other species. And that, of course, is a problem if we respond to them in negative ways as other species. And
yeah, you tell that story of one of the hunter-gatherer groups you were hanging out with that defined the world as people that are us and all those other losers that are not really human.
Well, yes, but I think most of us suppress those urges, and most of us suppress them so much we refuse to think we have them. But in fact, they're there in virtually everybody. Mahzarin Banaji at Harvard has developed a test, where you can show that no matter how much you think you see people as equals, your brain is like not responding to different races in the way you think, no matter how progressive you are. And so the good news is there well, the bad news is that we're doing it, but the good news is you can suppress it. And it doesn't need to be harmful. You don't have to see other groups as harmful, but you will see them as different. And we're not going to lose that. We love our groups, and we're built to see those groups. And those aren't going to go away. Yeah.
As you probably know, she's gotten a lot of pushback on that theory the last couple of years, or last year in any case. It's one thing to see differences. It's another thing to then put a label on them of bigotry, racism, and so on. Most of us in the modern world don't act on those.
No, we don't act on those. That is so correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't like this. I've never really liked that idea that that we're subconsciously racist and bigoted, and it's like, well, I don't feel like I am. Well, you are, but it's unconscious.
Well, you should try the test.
Oh, I've taken the test. I'm just like everybody else. Yeah, I definitely.
And you can't train yourself out of it. No matter how.
That's right. Even blacks are racist against blacks, and so on. This is what I'm wondering though. What picking up differences, of course, is normal. I see differences in animals or fruit or whatever. So what? That doesn't make me a fruit bigot or something like that.
No. It's those cultural things we add in. But the point is that categorization comes normally.
Yeah.
Those groups are essential. They give us meaning and validation. And the main problem becomes when we misuse those categories, and we don't need to. Marilyn Brewer is one person that has shown that we don't need to connect these things with negative valuations of anyone else.
Right.
They're neutral in themselves.
So the problem you're trying to solve in the human swarm is how you scale up from hunter-gatherers to nation states. So kind of walk us through your basic premise there.
Oh, well, one aspect of this is whether nation states are any different than hunter-gatherer groups. And it turns out hunter-gatherer groups are not bands. Bands are parts of larger groups that were societies and well-bounded. And one of my arguments is that all the rules that happened with hunter-gatherers apply to larger societies. They're just the opportunity to scale up was there. And so, it's not immediately obvious that would be so. Alien landing on Earth 20,000 years ago and seeing these little groups would come back today and see these, a billion people in China and think we had to evolve somewhere. But my contention is there's no reason to believe that. I mean, we could have evolved some, but the basic rule plan for these identities applies no matter how big they are. See, once you have labels, as an ant does with its scent, your colony or society can grow to any size as long as those labels are understood by everyone as meaning you belong, and everyone consistently uses those labels. So there are many other answers to that question, because societies, as they get bigger and humans, are certainly more complex a problem than they are for ants. And so we had to develop things like leadership and other aspects of our identities as individuals to feel comfortable in bigger societies. But a big part of that is simply communication, and this hasn't been appreciated. One thing societies had to do to grow isn't just to get more food. Most people talk about civilizations as if, well, we invented agriculture so there was more food for more mouths. But it turns out that you can look at monkeys in cities, and they're getting really fat off of agriculture, and they're stealing stuff from markets and so forth. And I started to poke around, and turns out their troops are hardly any bigger than their country bumpkin friends. What happens is that they're crowded, but it's a lot of small societies in one place, a lot of small troops all packed together. And you see something similar in New Guinea, where you have more than 1,000 tribal groups packed together. You can walk 3 or 4 miles, and it's a completely different language. So the question of how societies got bigger includes identity. People have to be comfortable with more and more people entering the coffee shop, and from people from farther and farther afield. And that was aided a lot by things like, getting horses, having roads like the Incas, not just language, but written language, and leaders that set down rules. Those often bore heavily on how people perceive themselves. They're not really looked that way, but the Romanization across Rome, if you look across Rome, people all took on the identity of the Roman Empire with their own twists here and there. The Brits had a British version of that and so forth. So looking at that essential part of being in a large society is a part of the story.
And you have a chapter on trade, the importance of trade, as a way, I suppose, of breaking down those natural barriers, that this is somebody I don't have to fear that's going to kill me if I'm trading with him.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is alliances do not reduce the differences between the societies. In fact, they can put up even stronger differences. So even today, Americans are flooding our stuff into places like China, but arguably the Chinese are getting more Chinese about it. And so, we can take on things from other societies and turn them into something of our own, and without changing the boundaries of our society. So, my favorite example is that the Statue of Liberty was, made by Mr. Eiffel, the same guy who made the tower. And so we completely forget this. It's our symbol now. So, the allowance for trade does not break down or reduce the need for the groups, but it does lead to all kinds of opportunity of relationships between societies that ants don't have, because ants either kill the enemy or run away from them. There's nothing in between. Well, there's slavery in a few of them. So,
right. But one of the things trade does, in addition to its economic benefits, it's a little bit like the potlatch. It's I'm giving you something, you're giving me something, and if we're talking and exchanging with each other, we're not fighting. And so it reduces maybe natural tensions or natural xenophobia.
Yes, between those groups, it does. Yes, it does indeed. But of course, ironically, every time, like the Iroquois Indians are an example where several tribes got together and formed this nation and had it for quite a while. But anybody's not in there is even more panicked now. So you end up with even more severe and difficult relations outside of your alliance. So ironically, looking at things system-wide, the question has become how to manage that. You develop an EU for pro-Europe people, but then people outside can feel like they're getting too big a cut of this and that, and we end up with these arguments. And
you have the nice discussion about why the EU doesn't quite serve the same role that a nation does, because there's not a common language, there's not a common border. It doesn't do the same trick, even though that's kind of the goal, is to have a United States of Europe, but it's not the same.
Yeah, no, the EU can never replace the countries. The EU has no set border, as we can see with Britain leaving. It has a history of animosities going back to the Middle Ages. It has countries that completely don't relate to each other, communist and capitalist countries. And as you say, most importantly, perhaps, it has none of these markers of identity that really bind people, like songs and ancient histories and so forth, that countries allow. So ultimately, the EU, like any alliance of societies, is disposable, but it's an economic tool that can be used wisely. So if it's understood that way, you might well want to be in it, Britain. But,
I always thought it as a mark of progress, a common currency, and you don't need a passport to move between countries. Kind of greases the wheels of commonality and breaks down natural tribal barriers. Even if the languages are different, you can kind of appreciate the language differences like you would food differences if you can just interact with each other much easier.
Yeah, no, definitely so to a degree, though these things can break down at a moment's notice, as we've seen here. And the real goal, as I said, because the relationships to people outside these unions becomes problematic and perhaps even worse, the real goal is this idea of cosmopolitanism,
right,
put to the limit, and that is simply impossible in my view. This is the idea of building some kind of umbrella organization that becomes more important to people's individual nations, and the fact that will never happen. People, even under stress, Ronald Reagan talked about the fact that, if only Martians would land,
right,
we'd all do well. But I give a story in the book and point out that, the Europeans landed in Australia, and immediately the Australians' minds were blown. Their own little petty differences between their tribes would seem trivial compared to these Europeans, which are essentially Martians, arriving. But none of their societies broke down. The societies stay in place. They give people that validity that we were just talking about. And they aren't going to go away. I mean, you can look at places, the examples I love to find have to do with the fact that to have a society, you have to have another society as a point of comparison. If there's no society, there's no us and them, the whole idea of a society breaks down. So have there been any places in the world where there were no societies, where people were just one common group of individuals sharing a social bond? You might look first in some of the remote islands, but even there, people would land and very quickly, it appears, break into tribes as soon as there were enough of them. So Easter Island had 17 head-erecting groups that fought quite a bit in that case. You talk about fission fusion. So when does a fusion start to fizz? That is, is it that Dunbar number where you end up with 150 or so? No, Dunbar number has nothing to do with any of this.
Yeah.
Arguably, Dunbar number has to do with what happens within societies, the groups you can have. But the truth is that the societies never fuse of their own free will. It has never happened. It doesn't happen in animals. You can look, and I've been looking across the animal kingdom. It's not been a question that's been asked. The only examples I've seen are perhaps in elephants, where these small units that they form can come back together when they had once been a single unit that split apart, proving again that elephants never forget. But
that's right. You talk about fusion mainly through colonialism and slavery and conquest.
Yes. This is the thing that makes us really fundamentally different from other species is we have that option. And so the reason that option exists is because if you go back far enough in time, people would transfer between societies. Animals transfer between societies. It's always arduous. You have to become a member of a different group. So you're going to be pushed around. It's going to be something that you might fail at. And across species, you have to do that. Most of these vertebrates have very small societies, so you needed individuals from the outside to breed with sometimes. And humans, that would happen through usually a woman marrying into another society, and she was expected to take on the language and many of the other attributes of the society. She'd never be completely successful, and so she'd always appear to be a bit of an outsider. But as long as she did that, she would be part of the society. That capacity amplified many times when we went to more aggressive modes of taking in larger numbers of people, which was slavery and subjugation. in that case as well, individuals were expected, if they were to assimilate and be allowed into the society at all in any reasonable sense, they were expected to take on the language and other attributes of the society. And so those kind of aggressive patterns that we see were really the only way things happen for most of human history. Immigration is a pretty modern idea. It does not go far back in time. And it's really interesting that I don't see that discussed very often. The idea of voluntarily bringing in large numbers of outsiders and expecting them to enter the society and be part of it, freely moving within the society in most cases, is pretty extraordinary that it occurs at all. But it still comes with these expectations of status and dominance differences that sort of emerged out of this aggressive background.
Well, wait a minute. What about hunter-gatherer groups that say the females from one group marry into another group? In other words, they're kind of migrating into a new group, and that keeps some genetic variation going.
Well, as I said, this happens in all societies of all animals, transfers of individuals, and often refugees. Refugees might be allowed in, but it's a scattered individual once in a while. You never found in hunter-gatherers, particularly the roaming bands of hunter-gatherers, these ethnic differences, these different backgrounds all mixed together in a society. You find scattered individuals.
So So that's different than masses of people coming in.
The difference is like actually taking in an entire society, swallowing up entire society is almost always a sign of aggression. Usually immigration does not include an entire society. And yes, again, as I said, immigration as well, having some expectation of some status difference and so forth. So that's easiest when conditions are good, when we have lots of jobs for immigrants, and they can fit in to do jobs that we don't want to do often, or they may, in some cases, have specialized things that they do that gives them some special opportunities. But they have to. Immigrants basically have to contribute without competing for it to be comfortable. And at times like this, when people feel stressed about their jobs, are the times when immigration is most tricky.
Right. Jared Diamond talks about, he tells me a story of when he first started going to Papua New Guinea doing birding. And he and his Papua New Guinean guide are walking down a path, and they encounter a stranger. They see a stranger sitting on a rock over there. So Jared's like, well, let's go talk to that guy. And his guide is like, are you out of your mind? We don't know who that is. That could be suicidal. You don't just walk up and shake somebody's hand who's a total stranger here. And I always think of that when I think of immigration. It's like maybe there's a natural impulse to be xenophobic, wary of people that are different from us until, there's trust established, which is through these signals that you talk about. So maybe when Trump, waves the red meat for his base, saying, the Mexicans are bringing their rapists and their drugs and their diseases over here, he's tapping a very ancient disgust emotion in the brains of Americans.
Yeah, and this disgust is really important. Paul Bloom and others are studying that kind of response we have to immigrants, which is why they tend to be described, and even today are being described as low animals or diseased and so forth. So getting past that is a trick. And as I say, it becomes easier when they provide for a need. And so even Black Americans have had who have been here for generations and aren't immigrants originally, have had the highest status in this country in times of war when they could serve in the military. That's when their status goes up. And same with Comanches. The Comanches took slaves, but you become a full Comanche because they were losing a lot of Comanches. There was fighting going on. So you'd enslave people, but you'd say, hey, you can marry this lady over here and become one of us if you fight and you do a good job. And this is the way of, quickly moving up. And so these opportunities arise when the conditions are right. Unfortunately, at the same time, you can have situations during times of stress and war. War supposedly brings people together. There's a lot of famous literature on that. But when you look at it, people can be torn apart within the society because anyone remotely connected with that outside group that's the enemy gets knocked down. Famously, the Japanese put in internment camps, but today it can be people from the Middle East and so forth. And so, one ethnicity can drag others with them because people tend to be poor at telling ethnic groups apart. And so you get this cascade of actually societies actually having more dysfunction, as well as not just being drawn together, but being dysfunctional at the same time, depending on what's happening.
Reminds me of a bumper sticker I saw on a car here in Southern California. It said, why the hell should I press 2 for English? You know, because we have a huge Spanish-speaking population in Southern California, and the feeling is if they're coming here, they should speak English. That's one of those signs, I think, that you're talking about, right? That we kind of look for something, and language would be one of them, that you have to adopt or else leave.
Right. On the other hand, it's a trick to keep a society together without some common threads. This is another thing. And so there is an element of truth to the fact that we have to build some commonalities to be seen as a society and perceive each other as a society. So certainly, you know, when immigrants come today, they are expected to pass tests and so forth. But the fact is those tests are pretty minimal representations of membership nowadays. They can be things about the symbols of the society, the flags and the history and so forth, and they can be certain expectations of cultural mores and behaviors. But the problem is, an interesting fact there is that facts aren't enough. They're learning facts, but membership in the society isn't about facts. Sociologists are fascinated by symbols. They think, symbols separate us from animals. But as you probably know, virtually no American, certainly you and I, would pass the immigration test. Why are there those stripes in a flag? What are the full words of the Star-Spangled Banner? What's a spangle?
People don't even know what's in the First Amendment. They don't know what the Bill of Rights is.
So the thing is, we don't need to know those details.
Right.
Those details, those symbols that we so prize, are in fact irrelevant to our membership in a society. We get feelings about the flag without thinking about what it means. And so those people that are coming in, the immigrants, are learning things that don't really represent membership in our minds. What membership in our minds is a way of being. It's that way of talking, walking. It's what we see when we see that guy in New Guinea sitting by the side of the road, and we go, no, he doesn't belong here. I'm not comfortable walking up to him. It's not because we've asked him to tell us what the flag means.
Right.
We do this constantly all the time, and we're responding to that in ways often that are quite reactive in times of stress, particularly like now.
Yeah, it's like you go back a century, right after the First World War, German Americans were very suspect. And before them, Irish Americans were very suspect. And it's like all immigrants seem to have to go through this stage or phase for a while, and then they're, I guess they're just adopted as honorary Americans after maybe 2 generations or so.
Yes, well, the question is what citizenship even means. And T.H. Marshall, who's the British sociologist that sort of defines citizenship, most often used definition, talks about it as to be accepted as a full member of society. And the trick there is what you mean by full, because ethnic groups are not usually considered full members of the society. The problem with it is that the dominant group, obviously Caucasians in our case, the dominant people, control the wealth, power, and the symbols of the nation. So ethnic people have to conform to the beliefs and the insecurities of the dominant people. To feel the dominant people have to be comfortable. They get to decide the rules of entering the coffee shop. So that means, curiously, a number of things. One is that freedom, we value freedom, but what does freedom even mean? We think of it as a big deal in this country, but if you look across all the national anthems of the world, the word freedom comes up more than any other. So obviously other people think that they're free.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, you realize that freedom has to do with all societies depend on extracting some degree of loss of choice from their members. That's how societies exist. And if you feel the rightness of those losses of choice, you feel comfortable. And the freedom you feel is within those limits. So if you don't like the fact that women vote, which we didn't for a long time, if you don't like burning the flag, if you don't like certain kinds of marriage, you're not thinking like, well, that's a shame because I've lost some freedom in my society. No, you're thinking chaos. So we feel free within these constraints, and every society has their own constraints, and every society, except the most repressed, feels free. But to get back to the point, the ethnic groups, because this dominant people set the rules of what this freedom is, experience less freedom. They're more constrained. And one of the things that they have to do, that they're expected to do, is to fit in with what the dominant people want, and that is not to be too different from the dominant people. They should know what to be happy about the flag and all that sort of stuff, but they shouldn't be too like the dominant people. There's a famous phrase in sociology, the marginalized man. And that's someone who, say, is a Latino person who tries too hard to be white. And he's going to be rejected by his people and rejected by white people, and he has nowhere to go.
Right.
So that, in a sense, to boil it down, means that, say, if you're a Latino person in America, you have to invest a fair amount of your calories in being a Latino person. You are constantly aware that you're a Latino person, and whereas a Caucasian person doesn't need to be. Almost all the time, a Caucasian person just is a member of a society. And you can show that by asking someone to think of an American in their head. And 99.9% of the time, they're thinking of a white guy.
Is this what's meant by checking your white privilege? I mean, you and I are not even aware that we have this advantage that we don't even have to think about, whereas someone who's Black or Latino does.
Yeah, and and it wears them out in a way that we as outsiders would really have a hard time figuring out. And how that is a loss for them is that you and I can be our quirky selves. I can invest a lot in being this quirky traveling guy and developing all these characters, and these kinds of things are not as accessible to people of ethnic groups because they're burning out their calories just being part of a group. We can be individuals. We can be as members of the dominant group, we have a better allowance for developing our individual characteristics and being persons. Yeah.
I was talking about this with Jared Diamond the other day. I just recorded him for his book, comes out in May. That United States is kind of in the middle of countries on how open we are about immigration. Some are much tighter, some are much looser. And yet, for some reason, it's really emerged just in the last 2 years, I think probably because of Trump, but not just Trump, but sort of the rise of populism, some authoritarianism around the globe, which I think naturally puts up those barriers that of fear of the other immigrants and so on. And then it's exacerbated by the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism. It makes it easy to go down that path of Islamophobia. We don't want them here. And then someone like Angela Merkel, who I respect very much, opens the borders up to Germany to let the Syrian refugees in, which is absolutely the moral thing to do. Somebody needs to help these people that are, really at risk. And then all of a sudden, Germany has all kinds of immigrant problems and people, breaking the law or whatever, taking advantage of the system and whatnot. So you can understand why people then push back against immigration. In other words, it's not just, you can't just say people that are against immigration are just xenophobes and they're racist and bigots. They actually have arguments for why we can't just open the borders up. Yeah,
and there can be good arguments. It's being a nationalist is a point of view that's quite reasonable. Nationalism, as it's expressed in extreme form, obviously isn't. But there are reasons to not just open the floodgates for any population and to have rules for safety. The question is what those rules are. Oddly enough, I don't feel those rules. I move through the world, and I've had machine guns jammed in my face, and I've had aggressive people around me often, and I just talk my way through it, and I have a good time, and I don't feel like, I'm unreasonable. I don't feel these fears. On the other hand, there's probably, there's a reasonable chance that I'm pushing my luck eventually, but in the due course of my life, I feel like it's a better direction to go in because I have managed to live with all kinds of different people and enjoy them and being invited into houses. You go into a place like Iran and there may be some argument at the beginning, as you might get into an argument going to New York, for heaven's sakes. But soon enough, you're in their houses talking to their families, and it's great, and you're communicating.
Well, here, this might be just temperament. I would say on the Big Five, you probably score very high on openness to experience.
Yes, and that's something that, nationalist personalities don't.
Right.
And an interesting question is why these personalities exist.
Yeah, I mean, like conservatives, for example, famously have fewer books on travel in their personal libraries, and they travel less than liberals do.
That's because they're into those digital books. They're way ahead of us.
Right, sure. But I mean, Mark, we have to get past this nationalism business. I mean, we're going to hit 10 billion people by 2050. I had, at the last chapter of The Moral Arc, I kind of went into my science fiction fantasy mode of imagine a world with no economic borders or political borders, and we return to the city state as kind of the focus of political power, and then people can just move or whatever they want. But since I wrote that, the world's gone in the opposite direction of kind of shoring up those both political and even economic borders. It seems like we're moving backwards.
Yeah, well, one hopeful sign, though it is not very hopeful for us, is there's a guy named Peter Turkin at the University of Connecticut who's a Russian ancestor fellow who's worked on gathered huge amounts of data on the life cycle, the cycles that societies go through. And he finds that societies go through a 50-year cycle. And so you can go back from our time to the 1960s, 1910, 1860s, and you can keep going back, and you'll see these cycles. And he has theories about why these cycles exist, but they seem to be really there. The trouble is that cycle is long enough that we're stuck in the damn middle of it. So, come on, get me to the other end. Can I have can I have been born 10 years from now? So
yeah, I'm always leery of historical forces because it's too metaphysical for me. It feels too like there's some kind of supernatural force at work, or some kind of like Marxian, Hegelian inevitability to history. I don't think it works that way. I think it's just human action, and we can do something about it like now, not in 50 years.
Yeah, well, the trick is we know a lot now, and we don't seem to be able to stop things. And it's like, this is the discouraging fact. I mean, we know a lot more about psychology and so forth. So
let me just ask you this. Okay, so 2020, we have a new president, whoever it is, I'm just speculating here, and they call you in and say, Dr. Moffett, we want to bring a biologist on board here on our panel, in administration. Give us some advice on immigration. What should our policy be? What's the right immigration policy?
Yes. Well, I'd first direct them to research on ants because it's greatly underfunded.
Okay, right.
But basically, you're going to get counter reactions to immigration no matter what, depending on people's perception of the economy. So whatever you do to improve perception of the economy certainly helps. But the fact is, I don't see anything around that. I didn't write this book to come up with a solution. I just was going through any number of lines of inquiry I could until I reached the ultimate dead end of what could even be said. So I feel that I'm not sure I could sing sing the song that they need to find their way through. But the fact is that feelings of stress around identity have to do with these are the essences of what we're talking about. So
you mean they're taking our jobs, or they're using our social system without paying into it, that kind of thing? Like it feels morally unjust.
Correct. And I find it hard to even imagine this, because to me, a person taking the job is the best person taking the job. But for a lot of people, the ethnicity of that person matters. And so
what are your thoughts on income inequality with regard to the kind of tension within a society and polarization of people and groups?
Well, as I say, we let people into the society based on the psychological reckoning that they are lower status than us. And in fact, people come into our society often knowing they're lower status than us because they've come from a really poor society, so they're going to be all right with that. So people come into the society, enter into the society in these strata. The real question becomes, when they're in their third or fourth generation, and they start to think, well, why aren't I moving up? Why aren't I the doctor and the lawyer? And this is when things get harder to work through, and certainly that's true for Black Americans throughout time. They were basically shafted right after the Civil War because none of them could ever find jobs. Who's going to hire, who in the South, having fought this war, is going to hire Black Americans right away? It was a disaster for the longest time that no one particularly looked at. In any case, yeah.
Well, when I started teaching college in the early 80s, and this is about when kind of affirmative action took off in the academy, where we want to allow students from different socioeconomic classes and races and so on in to diversify our very white population. And of course, then there's pushback that continues now that, that you're using different standards of admission, grades, SAT scores, and so forth. You're lowering your standards to let these people in. But the argument is that, well, it's going to take 2 or 3 generations. In other words, the kids, these 18-year-olds coming into college, this was in the 80s, still now, I suppose, their parents didn't go to college at all. They just got here, or they're just the first-generation immigrants. So we have to lower the standards, let them in. Their kids, when they enter college in another 20 years, then their SAT scores and GPAs will be higher, and then we'll make society better that way. That's kind of the long-term argument, I think.
Yeah, and then there's at the same time, there are groups that come in with such a strong work ethic that they're leaping to the top right away, and that's also a threat. So
Asians, yes. Oh, that's an interesting point to your previous point about we like the immigrants to come in because they know their place down below us, and here these Asian kids come in, or the parents and then the Asian next generation shoot straight to the top of Harvard. And that's what that lawsuit's about.
Yeah. And, it's just, again, even though they've got a high status, there can be a sense of threat about that. They still feel less American. This is, when you actually survey people, when you're an Asian American, as I mentioned somewhere in the books, there's some studies on this, you can be asked fairly often, where are you from? And they don't mean for you to say Chicago.
Right.
You don't walk up to a Caucasian person and ask, where are you from? Germany? This does not happen.
Right.
So, in fact, this kind of perception, to get back to what we were talking about, some of the things we were talking about before, reduces people's feeling of connectedness with their own society. They may love the flag and everything else, but they're constantly being seen somewhat as an outsider. And so we are working against their own interests in a lot of ways. Across the board, our whole psychology is so darn fascinating, I must say, because if we have this perception out there that Black Americans should be good at sports and bad at this, these are perceptions that actually lead to more Black Americans investing in being good at sports and bad at this. And if you throw out the perception that a certain group is going to commit crimes, ironically enough, you can push for more people actually seeing that as a solution to their problems and more crimes from those groups. So these perceptions of each other actually affect everyone's behavior. So if we could just get our perceptions on the same positive scale, we could get things to work out. But that isn't how it works, because every time someone commits a crime and they happen to be an ethnic person, the blame gets smeared around to other people in that group. In a way, it doesn't happen if, Timothy McVeigh kills a couple hundred people. He's a dysfunctional person. It's not anything about him being white. But if it's an ethnic person, it's an automatic thing that people go in that direction to actually blame, in effect, others of that group.
Yeah, conservatives always make a big deal about, well, why is the percentage of blacks in jail higher than whites? Because blacks commit more crimes. Why? Because they're black. Well, then, Pinker makes the point, but, 2 generations ago or a century ago, the Irish Americans had the highest crime rates. And then it was whoever else, some other group had the highest crime rates. And the same arguments were made. Well, that's what the Irish do. They get drunk and they commit crimes. And, so we just I think that's that kind of essentialism we have that you talk about, that we impugn in people, like you have this certain essential characteristic, and then we throw in whatever is associated with it, your skin color or whatever, group membership.
Yeah, and all these things are thrown in very fast, and before we blurt out our beliefs right after we see a person, before we have a chance to even think. So, yeah, and this is the fascinating thing, and this is the thing we do suppress. We learn to deal with that all the time, but kids are poor at suppressing it. So kids are likely to say inappropriate things all the time. And if you suppress it, it can be very effective. In fact, sometimes it can be too effective. In fact, it's an ironic fact that a racially biased person can come off to someone of an ethnic group as being a less biased than someone that's trying hard to connect with them, because the racially biased person tries to overcompensates. And so, all these subtle cues we're throwing them around and getting befuddled results left and right. And it's hard to know what to do with that, to go back to me being the advisor to the president, because these are things that happen before people even think. And they happen all the time. Doctors give more drugs to and better diagnoses to white people than black people. Now, ironically, the opioid crisis could be a result of that, because most of those drugs have been going to Caucasian people, a bias that did not work in this particular case.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's talk about war. You have a chapter on human conflict, and as you know, but for our listeners that don't, there's this ongoing battle within anthropology and spilling out into evolutionary psych and sociology and so on. Are we by nature war-making beings, more like primates, more like chimps? Are we more like bonobos, and it's civilization that has corrupted us into being chimp-like in conflict? Where do you come down on that debate?
Well, I find it hard to figure out this debate at all, because to me it's obvious that we have to do both. Other species, a major role of societies across species is to provide and protect for the members. And so depending on the situation, virtually any species is going to go into protect mode at some point. The question is where it is, that mode, where the kickoff point is for that mode or whatever. And so to me, clearly we have got a middle ground that allows for all kinds of cooperation, alliances. It doesn't break down societies. It's foolish to say that, but it does allow for relationships between societies of any sort, depending on the payoff at the time. So, in pure economic terms, you can see that there'll be a variety of things that can happen between societies in humans. And it's true of most species as well. Chimpanzees tend to be more aggressive, and bonobos tend to be less. But one could wonder what their environmental situation is that leads to levels of competition causing those levels of aggression. And so I just see us as dynamic. I don't see us as one or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. I think the word war is the wrong word, because we envision masses of armies, or in your metaphor with the ants, that these ants devouring each other, and hundreds of millions of little ant soldiers or whatever. If you have a band of a couple hundred people, you're not going to really have a war like we think of war, but there's still conflict. So there's these archaeological sites where something like 20 to 25% of the skeletons indicate a violent death in some kind of conflict. Well, you don't have to call it war, but it's a physically violent, dangerous environment compared to, say, bonobos. So we're more chimp-like than we are bonobo-like in terms of these intergroup conflicts, or at least the potential for it.
Yeah, well, war is really a poorly used term. When you look at it in terms of ants and humans, I think it's a mass-scale conflict of group against group where both sides can face wholesale destruction. It's not just genocide. It's just not killing an individual. There are people who use war at the least, evidence. And that's an interesting stage in conflict. The possibility of war happens in both ants and humans when societies reach into the tens of thousands or more, where you can have this, in the case of ants, it's reserve force in the nest that doesn't have to do much because your economics of per capita goes down in a favorable way. So large societies can actually create these reserves that fight in mass, and they do it in really interesting ways in both species. But you're right that it's aggression between groups that is directed at the group rather than at the individual, and can cause more than the death of an individual. It's basically a mass kind of thing, war.
I remember when I read Conrad Lorenz's book on aggression, and he talked about these hunter-gatherer bands that would square off to each other, and it was more symbolic, throwing spears that weren't going to quite reach their targets, and this counting coup where you'd sneak in the middle of the night and touch one of the warriors and leave. That made you a great warrior. You were able to get away with this. And that was kind of that 70s argument that war is not natural to our human nature. It happens because of the corruption of civilization and large populations and resource depletion and so on, that humans are naturally relatively peaceful. But, since the 90s or so, the evidence has kind of gone the other way, that these small bands of hunter-gatherers, whatever you want to call it, war is not the right way. But they do commit high rates of violence. Even if you sneak in, so you sneak in at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning when the other guys are still asleep, and you attack them in their sleep, and you still have a 25% mortality rate. You don't have to call it war, but it's still a dangerous place to live.
Yeah, and again, I think this is going to swing back and forth again and again, because it's somewhere in the middle, and our capacity to do both is the essential matter. These acts of aggression that we're talking about need to be directed between groups to be interesting. I mean, you could always have someone that sleeps with your sister in your own group or the other society over. And in both cases, you may want to go kill them, but that's because you have a relationship with a person that you don't like. So you have to separate aggression but within groups from between groups to really tease apart what's happening. And a lot of people don't do that very neatly. A reason to have societies isn't just for cooperation, but it's to be around the enemy And so if you have a circumcised group with a certain membership, and They can include all kinds of enemies and all kinds of other kinds of relationships. And in times of hardship, it can get really bad in a society like Venezuela right now. Ironically, though, Venezuelans really are patriots. They love their country. This has nothing to the dysfunction, the anger, the things that go on in a society can be independent of people's connection with that society. And that's one thing we have to remember when we're talking about the kind of problems we see in America today. But again, those are different things than relationships between societies. So those can be based on sort of more arbitrary cues, more kind of sense of identity rather than individual connections and relationships.
Yeah, you mentioned Richard Wrangham in your book. You traveled somewhere with him, or you were in some tribe with him or something like that? And
I visited his field site in Uganda, yes.
Oh, that's right, yeah. So he's got a new book. I had him on the podcast, The Goodness Paradox. The paradox is that we should be more like chimps, and yet he says we're self-domesticated. We've kind of made ourselves more like bonobos over, say, the last 10,000, 50,000 years, something like this, by killing off. One theory is that it's kind of a capital punishment or execution of bullies and free riders and people that are, not making society very pleasant for the rest of the group, that we've kind of eliminated them out of the gene pool.
Yeah, well, the self-domesticated thing is, I think, very cool. The fact is there's all this information on domestication as well, and it may be true across species to some extent, I still wonder, the rebel without the cause, the young guy who impregnates 10 young women and then dies in a fiery, fireball when he's 25, still doing pretty successful. So
right.
I wonder about him. It's the Big Bang strategy of reproduction, as we call it.
Is that what that's called?
Well,
okay.
Something like that. Yes.
Then there's the sneaky fucker theory, where the lower ranking male sneaks around while the alpha males are off fighting, and it impregnates the women.
Yes, well, you're talking about my college days, but never mind. That was the only chance I had, damn it. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's fascinating stuff. It has to do with Richard finds more in males as members of society, as a reflection of society membership than females. I think that's wrong. Males have to patrol, they have to fight, they're doing all that stuff. But a female, even though a chimpanzee female has to move between societies and join a new group, once she's with it, she's there for life. She is fighting on that side or dying on that side. Everyone else will see where she belongs. So this kind of tribalism, if you want to call it that, reflects everybody in the society, no matter what. Even a hermit that doesn't want to get along with anybody and doesn't want to fight or do anything else can still get your damn passport if he wants. So again, it's getting us away from this view of societies being about families or cooperation and so forth, about setting limits and identity and what that means in terms of in-groups and out-groups and the psychology of our mucked up brains.
Yeah, a lot of the science has been male-driven, I suppose, or focused. There's this discussion about the future of AI. Are they going to take over? Are they going to kill us, conquer us? Or extraterrestrials come? What will they be like? Will they be aggressive, conquering, enslaving humans? Stephen Hawking makes this point about advanced civilizations on Earth and what happens when they come into contact with less advanced civilization. Pinker makes the great point. There is a species of highly intelligent creatures on Earth who are not like that. They're called women.
Yeah.
So I think that perspective is important when we're talking about these big civilizational issues. There's half the population is not bellicose and conquering like that.
Yes, but there's still and indeed, and may the men take on their points of view. But it's also incorrect to say that women aren't solidly members of societies, affiliated with societies to the same degree, psychologically responding to in-groups and out-groups and doing all the other things. They are doing it in a more managed way, I guess you would say, and certainly without aggression in the front of their minds as much. So may they get all the power. Thank heavens, ants are all female. Well, no, ants are a terrible example. Ants are all about battles. They don't have any alliances. So I better not go to ants. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. That's in the Bible, but you don't go to the ants for aggression.
I think one of the things that makes books like yours and Pinker's and Wrangham's and so forth, Ed Wilson, so controversial is because you're writing mostly about history and what's happened in the past. But what we care about is, well, what does that mean for now? What should we do? What does it say about our current morals or our future prospects and that sort of thing? So then it becomes kind of political. Like,
right.
Are you saying this is in our genes? And if you are, does that mean we can't change it? Because if it's in our genes, it's fixed. And, and then people go down this pathway, and then the science has to come out a certain way, or else we're not going to like the consequences of the results.
Right. Well, that's why I say at the front, I think of the introduction of my book that, people on both sides of the aisle are going to find things that they hate and like in my book, because I was just following the threads that I could. And I didn't want to make pronouncements. I do have some feelings about some things. But, I also kind of kept away from a lot of discussion about evolution in terms of inheritance and so forth. Frankly, there's a big discussion that's been going on for, I think, 1.7 billion years about kin selection versus group selection, and I find it boring. I have heard it so much. There's 1,000 iterations of it, and to me, a lot of the essentials were missing, and that's why I tried to do this groundwork about what a society actually is and how it replicates and what the individuals do within it, and those patterns. And it's the patterns that are interesting to me more than assumptions about genetics or not. So the parallels between ants and humans are great because they have nothing to do with genetics. They are parallels that arise with something that looks like a complete alien. And yet, when you have things like roadways and traffic rules and infrastructure and assembly lines and complex teamwork and slavery and warfare and public health issues management and just dozens of things that arise in a similar way, not in identical ways, but similar ways as problems between these groups that you would never see in a chimpanzee. A chimpanzee doesn't do any of those things. And why is that? It has nothing to do with genetics, inheritance, or anything else. It has to do with the fact that once you have a society of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions, you better have a way of dealing with public health issues. I can tell you, I've been with chimpanzees. They're not big on public hygiene, but 100,000 chimpanzees together, if they're going to survive, they're going to have to work that out. Genes, smarts, however they do it, but they're going to have to work it out.
I don't remember who made this analogy, but if you put 200 male chimpanzees in a jet and flew them across the country, what would it be like inside the cabin at the end of the trip? It'd be catastrophe.
Well, it depends entirely on whether they're part of the same group or not, but yes.
Oh, I see. That's true.
That's the thing, and we still have to think. And this is kind of bizarre. And I'll tell you, it's just totally bizarre. You can explain this to me, because even in psychology, they have this problem of confusing foreigners with strangers. Xenophobia, the primary use of the term, if you go to the big dictionaries like Webster's and Oxford, is in terms of a foreigner. But it's used loosely all the time with just strangers. And of course, they're completely different categories. You can have a foreigner friend that you know really well, and you could have a stranger next door who's an American who you never see and you find a bit suspicious. They're completely different categories, and how our brains are dealing with those categories is probably remarkably different. And yet even psychologists will often confuse these two. So the chimpanzees in the coffee shop, if they're all part of the same chimpanzee community, they're going to be just fine. I'm talking about chimpanzees mixing it up with chimpanzees they've never met. Their version of a foreigner is different than ours because it's any stranger. Our version of a foreigner is anyone with these different cues, whether we like them or not.
Interesting. Yes. Well, Mark, we've been going almost an hour and a half. The book is great. I really loved it. I listened to the audio version. It's well read, so I'd recommend people do either one. And how are you going to top this? What's next on your plate?
I'm going to go look at more animal societies. But you asked me for an E.O. Wilson story in there sometime. It didn't oblige. I think we diverged into Herve Devore, a fine fellow as well. But, I'll just say my favorite story about Ed was when I first met him. I was an undergraduate. I had no idea what I was doing. I've always told undergraduates who want career advice to be as ignorant as possible, because I visited Harvard. I had a social insect book for $1 from a book club, and I walked into his office and gave him a big double handshake like this and said, "Great to meet you, Ed." And he said, yeah. And so I came in and I found out afterwards that, well, until you get your doctorate, you're supposed to call him Dr. Wilson. But I had already started. So there you go. Anyway, we get down in the floor of his office and start looking at pictures of ants. And it was like being with another kid. And that's I think, the essential thing I've learned about every scientist I respect the most is they have that inner energy that, look at your face, same with you, that inner energy that comes from a childhood love of the subject and just pursuing it. And so, and that just kept going. And he let me travel around the world and do all kinds of crazy things, God love him. So
that's a great story.
Praise be.
You broke down that hierarchical barrier in one word.
Yes. I guess with the wrong person, I could have been driven out of the cafe or coffee shop.
That's professor to you, sir. No, that's great. That's a great Ed Wilson story. Yeah, you've met a lot of interesting people in your travels.
Well, meeting people is part of my the joy of traveling.
I mean, I sort of feel like when you're writing a big book like this, about civilization and societies and so forth, it's not enough to just know the science, which you clearly do, but I think it helps to have had some perspective. You've actually traveled a lot. To me, it seems like just whatever it's happening in your brain of integrating the different scientific findings and theories, that you've actually experienced some of this yourself directly, that's got to affect how you integrate those theories.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating thing to think about because, apparently I have a deficient brain because I have to travel more than most. I mean, Darwin was out there for, a year or two, and that was enough for a lifetime for him.
5 years, and then 5 years on the voyage of the Beagle, and then he never left home again.
Yes, it's like I just keep having to go. Same with Alfred Russel Wallace. Yeah. Same with my mentor and God, E.O. Wilson, who had a couple of big trips way back when, but he mostly stays home and writes about things with an eloquence of someone who's been there, no matter what. Makes me jealous.
Yeah, right. Well, Mark, I really kind of feel like there's a kind of a nexus of all the sciences coming together now to write big books like this. It would be fun to come back a century from now and see what scientists are thinking about then. Like, oh, those crazy people back in the early 21st century had this theory about this or that. It's just hard to get out of our own milieu. But, I really feel like we're at a moment when we can really bring a lot of these completely different sciences, and that balkanization of the academy, those walls are breaking down and people are talking to each other across these barriers. I think that's super good.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. So I talked for anthropology at Ann Arbor, Michigan a couple of days ago, and I'm going to be talking in psychology at Yale tomorrow. So it's like, this is awesome cool because, I love these freewheeling ideas. That's why academic departments have never made sense to me. Another reason other than not wanting to go to meetings and not wanting to grade people, that I've tried to maintain my independence, even though I have no idea where my next paycheck often comes from. But, reality is one kind or another. You pick your reality.
That sounds good. Mark, thanks a lot for doing the show. Congratulations on the book. It's a beautiful book. It's a great read. And we'll talk to you again.
Hey, Michael. Pleasure.
Bye-bye.